Hello again. I am Jim Staley. I have been bringing you lessons on evidences of God. And today we are going to conclude this series of evidences of God by looking at evidences of God in science. In the last 4 lessons, we started looking at evidences of God. There are 5 areas: life, nature, history, prophecy, and science. We started with life and then nature. From there, we went to history and prophecy. We have so much available to us just in any one of these to know there is a God. There is evidence that God is at work in our lives. We can see his work in nature. History contains evidence that not just Christians confirm the words written in the Bible. Prophecy makes it undeniable that the author of this book or authors of these books had extraordinary knowledge of future events. Today, we will conclude our look at evidences by looking at some areas where the Bible proved more accurate than science. Some very recent scientific discoveries proved the Bible correct over past scientific assumptions. Last time we looked at the 7 stars in the Pleiades constellation, the fact that the Earth hangs on nothing and the springs of the sea. Only recently have scientists discovered that the Pleiades star cluster is gravitationally bound, as the book of Job alluded to thousands of years ago. Today, we are going to look at medical facts found in the Bible that man has only started to understand. The first one we'll look at is in Exodus 15, verses 26. And I'll be reading Exodus 15, 23 through 26. Now, when they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. Then he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. There he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them and said, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." There were many laws of health and sanitation in the Bible that governed the daily lives of the Israelites. These laws show advanced knowledge that modern medicine did not understand until 3,500 years later. They stand in direct contrast to the medical practices of the Egyptians of the same area contained in the Priapus Evers, a medical book of the 1500 BC era. An example of the medical ignorance of these medical practices is an Egyptian prescription for healing a splinter wound. To splinters, the ancient Egyptian doctors applied a salve of worm blood and donkey dung. Since dung is loaded with tetanus spores, a simple splinter often resulted in a gruesome death from lockjaw. God made the promise to the Israelites there in Exodus 15:26 that if they followed his commands, which included those concerning health and sanitation, he would protect them. There are biblical laws on how to handle human excrement. It must be buried away from the camp. There in Deuteronomy 23:12-14, we can read about this. Because there it says, "Also you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment. And when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give you your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you and turn away from you." Cholera is a problem in many developing countries due to human waste not being properly taken care of. Charles C.J. Carpenter, a modern medical textbook, makes the following statement about cholera: "Careful hygiene provides the only sure protection against cholera." That's in Harrison's Principle of Internal Medicine, This is similar to a modern instruction method in a backpacking guide, Backpacking Basics by Thomas Winsett, who says, go at least 100 yards from water, trails, and camp, somewhere off the beaten path, and dig a hole at least 4 inches deep. To dig, use your heel, a stick, a rock, or a plastic trowel, which he carried for that purpose. Finally, cover up the results. Sounds just like what we read there in Deuteronomy 23. Human waste, left in the open, as many societies did and still do, carry viral and bacterial diseases. Many in our own day use rivers for toilets and for bathing. The World Health Organization estimates that nearly 2.2 million people die annually from diseases caused by contaminated water. God showed the nation of Israel the basics of hygiene and human waste thousands of years ago, and yet many countries today still do not follow these practices. When they do, they eliminate cholera and many other diseases. God gave regulations to Moses that are the equivalent to the modern concept of quarantine. And we're going to see that in Leviticus 13, 14, and 22, as well as Numbers 19:20. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantina giorni, meaning space of 40 days, from quaranta, which is 40, from the Latin quarantinta. Quarantine was first enforced in 1377 AD, 2,877 years after the Mosaic quarantine law, when there was an outbreak of the plague. Venice required ships from plague-stricken countries to wait in their port for 40 days to make sure no active cases of plague were aboard the ships. In 1878, the United States quarantined yellow fever. In 1892, ships from Europe arrived with outbreaks of cholera among passengers, and the quarantine laws were further strengthened. In America, the Public Health Service Act of 1944 gave that agency the responsibility for protecting the country from the introduction, transmission, and spread of communicable diseases. It took thousands of years for the ancient, medieval, and modern world to realize what the Bible had been saying all along. We read Leviticus 13, 45 and 46. Now the leper on whom the sore is, his clothes shall be torn and his head bare. He shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall be unclean. All the days he has the sore, he shall be unclean. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. I'm going to continue reading because they're in Leviticus 14, 1 through 9. Current continues on. It says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, This shall be the law of the leper for the day of his cleansing. He shall be brought to the priest, and the priest shall go out of the camp, and the priest shall examine him. And indeed, if the leprosy is healed in the leper, then the priest shall command to take him who is to be cleansed 2 living and clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet, and hyssop. And the priest shall command the one of the birds to be killed in an earthen vessel over running water. As for the living bird, he shall take it, the cedar wood, and the scarlet hyssop, and dip them and the living bird in the blood of the bird that was killed over the running water. And he shall sprinkle it 7 times on him who is to be cleansed from leprosy, and shall pronounce him clean, and shall let the living bird loose in the open field. He who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. After that he shall come into the camp, and shall stay outside his tent 7 days. But on the 7th day he shall shave all the hair off his head, and his beard and his eyebrows. All his hair he shall shave off. He shall wash his clothes and wash his body in water, and he shall be clean. Infected persons were commanded to isolate themselves outside the camp until healed, and they were to shave and wash thoroughly. The priests, acting as medical control officers, were instructed to change their clothes and wash thoroughly after inspecting a diseased victim. This is also the first time masks were used in disease control. Think of the recent World Health Organization recommendations and compare them to this: washing, face masks, and isolation or social distancing. Wow. Until this century, all previous societies, except for the Israelites, who followed God's medical laws regarding quarantine, kept infected patients in their homes, even after death, exposing family members and others to deadly diseases. Leprosy swept through Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries. England, Sweden, Iceland, and Norway showed alarming increases in leprosy cases in the 16th and 17th centuries. But when the authorities began to institute the quarantine in the form of segregation of leprosy cases, it was again brought under control. Also, the Black Death was finally conquered by isolation of the sick through the use of quarantine. Again, God's instructions regarding quarantine to prevent the spread of leprosy and other infectious diseases were 3,500 years ahead of science. It wasn't until 1873 that leprosy was finally shown to be an infectious and not hereditary. There are many preemptive laws delivered by Moses, which includes washing one's hands and ritually bathing in running water after one is possibly contaminated. There in Leviticus 15:13. And when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleaning, washing his clothes, and bathe his body in running water. Then he shall be clean. Now let's also read in Numbers 19:11 through 19. For he who touches the dead body of anyone shall be unclean 7 days. He shall purify himself with water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not be clean. Whoever touches the body of anyone who has died and does not purify himself defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. That person shall be cut off from Israel. He shall be unclean, because the water of purification was not sprinkled on him. His uncleanness is still on him. This is law when a man dies in a tent. All who come into the tent and all who are in the tent shall be unclean 7 days, and every open vessel which has no cover fastened on it is unclean. Whoever is in the open field touches one who is slain by a sword, or who has died, or a bone of a man, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. And for an unclean person they shall take some of the ashes of the heifer burnt for purification from sin, and running water shall be put on them in a vessel. A clean person shall take hyssop and dip it in the water, sprinkle it on the tent and on all the vessels, on the persons who were there, on the one who touched the bone, the slain, the dead, or the grave. The clean person shall sprinkle the unclean on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. And on the 7th day he shall purify himself, wash his clothes, and bathe in water, and at evening he shall be clean. During disasters, when many human beings are killed, the rescue workers are now, many thousand years later, instructed to handle the unfortunate dead with masks and with protection for their hands and whole bodies. Direct contact with some of the dead people can spread hepatitis B and C, tuberculosis, cholera, or enteric intestinal pathogens. Even the foul odor of the dead contain cadaverine and puricin toxic to living ones if inhaled for a long time. The Bible says God gave those laws to Moses. If one believes that, then Moses was not the doctor of medicine, nor the greatest scientific mind who has ever lived. He was the leader of the Exodus. He was the one who transcribed those foresighted laws given to him by the Creator of man. We read Deuteronomy 10:12 12 and 13. This here is how it reads. Now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask from you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and love him, and to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the Lord's commandments and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good. That's what God has always put in his words. All his suggestions, all his demands, everything that we sit there and think of as being restrictive are only there for our good. Not there to make us feel miserable. It's actually there to help us enjoy more of life. So now let us look at some food-related items. Christianity is unusual among religions in that it does not have a closely defined purity code. There is not a laundry list of acceptable or forbidden foods. Most of the other major religions have some sort of purity code. Judaism is known for eating only kosher foods, which for those who are extremely orthodox or overwhelmingly devout can require 2 sets of kitchenware. Muslims avoid food that is not killed or cooked in a specific way to make it halal. It is said Hindus do not eat beef, and many Buddhists are complete vegetarians. You may be more aware of this than I. Christians, however, have no such restrictions. Some will keep to a version of the purity code listed in the Old Testament, but most Christians do not think twice about eating whatever they want unless they give up a specific food for Lent, if they happen to follow the Catholic directives. That does not mean that there is not wisdom in the purity code laid out in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In fact, the Old Testament purity code has some advice that is good for anyone to follow for a variety of reasons. Here are some forbidden foods in the Bible Christians should avoid. Let's read Leviticus 17, 10 through 12. And whatever man of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell among you who eats any blood, I will set my face against that person who eats blood, and will cut him off from among his people. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul. Therefore I said to the children of Israel, no one among you shall eat blood, nor shall any stranger who dwells among you eat blood. The purity code of the Old Testament is filled with injunctions against consuming blood. Beyond the various spiritual reasons that consumption of blood is forbidden, it may also be a food that is better to avoid for health reasons. Blood is considered a meat byproduct by the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, and it has to pass inspections both before and after the animal is slaughtered to be considered safe to eat. Pig blood must be heat treated, and all the stock must come from a country free of swine fever in order to avoid passing the disease on to humans. That's even after being heat treated. Similarly, there have been outbreaks of the H5N1 avian flu linked to this consuming dishes made with poultry blood. While blood can be a safe source of iron, it can also be very risky to eat, both due to lingering diseases and the risk of iron poisoning. It is no wonder that even in Christ's time in the New Testament, we are told not to eat blood or things strangled in Acts 15, 28 and 29, which I'll read that to you now. Acts 15, 28 and 29 says, for it seems good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things, that you abstain from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. If you keep yourself from these, you will do well. Pretty good conclusion. Well, let's look at some of these other things. How about animal fat? This one causes me conflict. I do like very lean meat. I do not like fatty pieces of meat. That is, unless it's bacon. I love my bacon. And I like it crisp. BLT, bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches are one of my favorites. After this lesson, I may have to change my views. If I read Leviticus 7:23-25, here it reads, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, You shall not eat any fat of ox or sheep or goat, and the fat of an animal that dies naturally, and the fat of what is torn by wild beasts may be used in any other way, but you shall by no means eat it. For whoever eats the fat of the animal of which men offer an offering made by fire to the Lord, that person who eats it shall be cut off from his people." Pretty serious consequences. While this is part of the Old Testament purity code that is often ignored, it is a good idea to follow it. Animal fat is horrifically unhealthy. While it may taste delicious, fat from animals is high in saturated fats. Saturated fats, in turn, are associated with heart disease, obesity, and other unpleasant health issues. While it may be acceptable from a spiritual point of view for Christians to eat the grilled fat on the edge of their steak, it is a better idea to simply cut it off and throw it out. There are other things that taste just as good without being so harmful to a person's health. Now, let's take a look at one of these others that is very interesting and timely today, and that's Leviticus 11. Contains the longest running list of what animals are considered clean and unclean. Certain sea creatures are said to be off limits, such as crustaceans, and there are certain land animals like pigs. Leviticus 11 makes it a point to list which birds should not be eaten by the Israelites. At the end of that list is bats. If we read Leviticus 11:13-19, this is what we can find. "And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. They are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard, the kite, the falcon after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw, and the carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat." People today are aware that bats are not actually birds, but flying mammals. They are also unlikely to wind up on a dinner table. While bats certainly seem like an odd food source for many Western Christians, there are plenty of places that see bats, especially large fruit bats like flying foxes, as a perfectly legitimate food source. Those who have no more problem eating bats than chicken, however, would do well to find an alternative food source. Bats are generally eaten in the Pacific Rim in Asia. While they may be a little harder to catch than the average bird, bat meat comes with a variety of risks. Bats are excellent vectors, animals that carry diseases, and those diseases can become lodged in bat flesh. People in Guam, for example, developed a neurological disease known as Lytico-Bodish disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Parkinsonism, dementia. The disease is as frightening as the massive name. Contracted by eating fruit bats, it's abbreviated ALS-PDC, is a twisted mixture of ALS, Parkinson's disease, and Alzheimer's disease, and it has a leading cause of death among the Chamorro people in Guam for more than a decade. Here's some other things according to the Wikipedia. Bat coronavirus, RATG13, is a SCARS-like beta coronavirus. It infects the horseshoe bat. It was discovered in 2013 in bat droppings from a mining cave. The cave was near the town of Tongguan in Mojiang County in Yunnan, China. As of 2020, It is the closest known relative of SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Bats harbor several viruses that are zoonotonic, meaning capable of infecting humans, and some bat-borne viruses are considered important emerging viruses. These zoonotonic viruses include the rabies virus, SCARS, COVID, Marburg virus, Nipah virus, and Hendra virus. While research clearly indicates that SARS-CoV-2 originated in bats, it is unknown how it was transmitted to humans, or if an intermediate host, possibly the Sundra pangolin, was involved. Now, the Sundra pangolin, also known as the Malayan or Javan pangolin, is a species of pangolin. It is found throughout Southeast Asia, including Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Singapore, Vietnam, and the island of Borneo, Java, Sumatra, and the Lesser Sundry Islands. It prefers forested habitations and plantations. A large part of its life is spent in trees. I bring up about the pangolins because the pangolins are a genus that are among the most heavily poached and exploited protected animals. Like other pangolin species, the Sundra pangolin is hunted for its skin, scales, and meat used in clothing manufacture and traditional medicines. Scales are made into rings as charms against rheumatic fever, and meat is eaten by indigenous people. Despite enjoying protected status almost everywhere in its range, illegal international trade, largely driven by Chinese buyers, has led to rapidly decreasing populations numbers. And there's one other animal that we can take a look at. Like bats, vultures. We read about vultures being included. Vultures are not something that most Western Christians would ever consider eating. Frankly, most Westerners are not, Christians are perfectly happy to pretend that buzzards do not exist. They are large, associated with death, and often painfully ugly. They are also about the worst thing to eat in a survival situation. In some way, it makes sense to see the vulture as a potential food source. They are slow flying, on the ground often, and very, very large. Logically, they would be easier to capture and eat than any other bird of similar size. Vultures, however, survive by eating rotting meat. This leaves them absolutely covered in bacteria. Vultures themselves are largely immune to the bacteria they consume. This is not the case for whatever eats them. In fact, almost nothing will eat a dead vulture, including other vultures. This is about as fragrant a sign as nature can create that says, do not eat. What about insects? We find that those things sometimes are a survival type situation. However, if we read Leviticus 11:20-23, all flying insects that creep on all fours shall be an abomination to you. Yet these you may eat of every flying insect that creeps on all fours, those which have joined legs above their feet with which to leap on the earth. These you may eat, the locust after its kind, the destroying locust after its kind, the cricket after its kind, and the grasshopper after its kind. But all other flying insects which have 4 feet shall be an abomination to you. It has become somewhat cool nowadays for a person to be able to claim that they ate bugs. Brownies with crickets in them are sometimes made by teens in a way of grossing out or scaring their friends, and social media has plenty of videos made for the shock value of watching friends eat fried tarantulas. Insects and arachnids are a great source of protein and a common staple in many parts of the world. They are also a risky food source. Leviticus states that people can only eat various species of locusts, katydids, crickets, or grasshoppers, while those who enjoyed conquering their fear of spiders by biting into a tarantula would argue that there are plenty of other sources of bugs that make acceptable food. The fact is that eating insects and arachnids is risky. Many insects and arachnids contain poisons that are toxic to humans. They are also excellent carriers of disease. While some may simply find eating creepy crawlies unpalatable, Leviticus may have been right to declare them off limits. It is simply too easy to pick up the wrong sort of bug. Christians generally do not pay much attention to the list of forbidden foods in the Bible. That said, there is some legitimate health advice in the Old Testament. Many of the foods that are considered off limits are things that Westerners are not planning to eat anyway, but some people still do consume those. Those that are thinking of trying out a new dish might want to think twice. If it contains something that Leviticus lists as a forbidden food, it might be in the best interest of your health to politely say, no thanks. This concludes our look at the scientific evidences of God. I hope this has been interesting and informative to you. May you build upon the information I have shared with you as you study God's Word. His Word contains many more proofs of His existence and that the Bible is a divinely inspired book. May God grant you health and safety. Until next time, peace and grace be with you. Thank you.